Growing up, I didn't have very many games for the PlayStation, but one game I did have was Spyro Year of the Dragon. I greatly enjoyed it as a kid, and as an adult it's still one of my favorite games of all time. In fact, it was replaying Year of the Dragon that made me eager to move on from the Sega Genesis library and start on the PlayStation library. And this is rather timely, as the Spyro Reignited trilogy is coming out in a few months. But unlike with the Crash Bandicoot games, where I was at least a little familiar with the whole trilogy, I actually never played either of the first two Spyro games growing up. So going in with a fresh perspective, how does the first game hold up? Let's take a look. The game opens with a news station of some kind interviewing some elderly dragons. They're discussing issues about the dragon worlds when they suddenly mention a guy named Nasty Nork, and proceed to insult him on air. However, Nasty Nork was watching the broadcast and doesn't take kindly to the insults. In retaliation, he unleashes a spell that turns all of the dragons to stone. I'd say that the premise of the story is rather silly, but considering who's in the White House at the moment, it may not actually be all that far-fetched. For whatever reason, the only dragon unaffected by the spell is a small purple dragon named Spyro, and he, along with his companion Sparx the Dragonfly, must travel across the dragon worlds, free the dragons, and recover the stolen treasure. Like many other 3D platformers of the time, your goal is to collect stuff. In this case, rescuing dragons, dragon eggs, and gems. Collecting enough of these will unlock new worlds and levels, until you eventually face off against Nasty Nork himself. The game is well put together, but it just didn't quite click for me. Part of the problem was my familiarity with Year of the Dragon, because while the presentation and gameplay are very similar, they're noticeably more rough around the edges in the original game. But even so, the game is still pretty good, and yet I just couldn't get into it. I think the biggest problem for me is the lack of any real story or character to give the gameplay context. Now, not every game needs an in-depth storyline to be good. I mean, the Crash Bandicoot games were pretty light on story, and I still liked them. The difference, however, is that Crash Bandicoot is structured similarly to 2D platformers of the past, with a level-by-level system where you always move in a straight line, and the emphasis is more on structured challenges and overcoming one obstacle at a time. Spyro the Dragon, on the other hand, is more open, both in its level design and structure, and feels more similar to the likes of Ocarina of Time, where it's more of a grand adventure across the lands rather than a rigid series of structured challenges. But Ocarina of Time actually filled this world with characters to make the world feel alive, where Spyro really doesn't. Sure, there are the dragons you rescue, but they just thank you, give you a hint about the gameplay, and then disappear. Other than that, there's no one in the various levels apart from enemies. Why am I fighting them? How do I know they're the bad guys? What if it's the dragons who are the real bad guys, and Nasty Nork and his followers are just rising up against a tyrannical regime that you're helping to put back in place? I know I'm overanalyzing, but I just didn't find the game to be all that interesting. It is fun to play, but I was always aware that I was just running around inside of a video game, and not an actual fantasy world. And while it's understandable that the game wouldn't be as polished as its successors, it still has some odd quirks to it. For instance, bosses are found in their own separate level. I thought you would fight a boss every time you went to a new world, as that's how most games would do it, so I was confused when that wasn't the case. For a while I thought there weren't going to be any boss fights in the game apart from the final one, until I happened to stumble upon one and figured out where the game was hiding its bosses. Although to call them bosses is a bit generous, as they're really just normal enemies who take a few more steps to defeat. And the final boss is really disappointing. After all this build-up, what does Nasty Nork do? He runs away. He just runs away. That's all he does. Come back here, you damn coward. I don't know. I can understand why people who grew up with this game really love it, but for me it just didn't do much. I've already started on Spyro 2, and from what I've played of that, I can already tell that it's a clear improvement. Maybe the Reignited trilogy version of this game will be better, but even if it is, the second and third games will also be better. So if you're new to Spyro, I would recommend trying Spyro 2 or 3, and unless you're really curious, you can go ahead and skip this one. My final score is a 7 out of 10. I know this may upset some people, but I'm sorry, I just didn't like the game all that much. Now let me be clear, it's not bad by any means, it's just kind of meh. So what do you think? Have you played the Spyro the Dragon games? Which one is your favorite? Whatever you think, be sure to let me know in the comments below. If you like what I do, feel free to subscribe and follow me on Twitter. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.